Hello, my name's Dr. Vicky Cleak and I'm a consultant psychiatrist with a special interest in adult ADHD. And today we're going to talk about how ADHD affects schooling and higher education. I hope you find this useful. So how does ADHD and the experience of having it affect your schooling and your experiences in higher education? Well, we know a lot of things about what happens with adults with ADHD. We know that they are more likely to have received extra educational support going through their schooling, have much higher rates of dyslexia, but also dyspraxia and dyscalculia. They're much more likely to have dropped out of higher education, to spend less time in education, get lower grades at school and in higher education. And of course all these have a knock-on effect in terms of finances, social attainment. It affects what job you get, how well you do financially, the social group you become part of, and generally your social and economic trajectory. So let's start at the beginning. If you go to primary school with ADHD, what kind of difficulties do you commonly find? Well, thinking about the core symptoms of ADHD, inattention, hyperactivity and impulsivity. The first, in terms of inattention, so you may have difficulty paying attention in class and thus miss instructions and fail to complete tasks or get into trouble because you're talking with your neighbour. You may appear forgetful and lose track of your belongings, so you may spend a lot of your time getting into trouble with your parents for not bringing the right equipment home from school for washing, or the right equipment into school to be used, and that can lead to anxiety. You may have great difficulty staying organised and completing assignments in terms of time management, remembering to bring the homework home, remembering to take the homework out of your bag. So all of these difficulties may well be down to problems with regulating your attention. And then in terms of hyperactivity, you may be more restless and fidgety, and so be constantly told off by your teacher or annoy your next door neighbour in class. You may interrupt others and have difficulty taking in turns because you can't wait, and or you're worried you'll forget what's going on in your head, the answer to the question, so you will not be able to stop and wait your turn. You may have difficulty staying seated during class, so often children preschool and school have to get up. Some will make excuses if they realise that they're going to get into trouble for it, like I needed to go and sharpen my pencil, or I need to go to the toilet, when actually they just need to stand up and move around. They also may have trouble participating in group activities because, again, they have trouble paying attention to what is going on in the group and taking turns and waiting. Those with ADHD are often more impulsive, so that's the blurting out of answers without waiting to be called on. It's very difficult for somebody with ADHD when they have a thought in their head not to act on it or say it out loud, and that can even be when there's no one around, but it's something very emotional to the person. They'll sort of talk under their breath, say it out loud. They may have difficulty waiting in line or waiting for their turn, so they can end up again getting into trouble. May struggle with self-control and act without thinking. When I take a history, I ask my patients about their experience of schooling and when and if they ever got into trouble. And people with ADHD often do things that they don't understand why they've done it. So, they may have got into a lot of fights, even though they don't see themselves as being an aggressive person. Generally, children with quite significant impulsivity traits as part of their ADHD may well get into trouble for speaking and acting without thinking. They also have a tendency to interrupt conversations or activities. They might interrupt their teachers, they might interrupt others when they're working, and again, it's because they have trouble stopping and thinking and waiting for their turn. So what about secondary school and the impact of ADHD there? Well, when you go to secondary school, there is a big difference with primary school. So you are no longer commonly in the same classroom. You have to move for different subjects between classrooms. You thus have to be much more organised about where your kit is and taking the right kit with you, as well as being much better time manager so that you get to your classes on time. Secondary school, because of this step up, often means that teachers as well as parents expect you to be able to do some of these organisational tasks that other children without ADHD can do much more easily. This means that often the first line of sorting out a problem is directly with the pupil rather than speaking immediately with parents. So a pupil with ADHD who's having difficulties, the difficulties may not be communicated to home and parents, and thus the child may have gone, several terms or years throughout secondary school without the school and the home pulling together to help the individual with some of these strategies that other people find much more easily. The other thing that happens between primary and secondary school is that often you'll have double lessons. So there are longer periods where you're expected to stay focused during your lectures and studying, which is more difficult for those with ADHD. That difficulty in regulating attention means that for people with ADHD, things they're particularly interested in and they find new and novel or speaks to their passions, they may be able to focus really well on those subjects. But other subjects where they don't have that same passion or interest, their functioning and their attention really drops off. And so you get this very inconsistent performance on assignments and exams, which can be quite characteristic of those with ADHD. Again, struggles with time management, which becomes more important as you get into secondary school, and meeting deadlines with homework. So homework and your ability to manage that is more important in secondary school than primary school. And if you haven't got a diary, you haven't got significant structural support at home with those things, then you may not realise you've got homework that needs to be given in until you have a chat with your friend on the bus. And in addition, those with ADHD often procrastinate, put off more boring subjects until the last minute. Again, that means they could be doing their homework on the bus on the way to school or even at school. And so it tends to be done without as much rigour or attention, and thus those with ADHD get lower marks. It's very common for people with ADHD to have sleep problems. The mental overactivity can mean that it's a struggle to get off to sleep, and you add into that hormonal changes that happened in secondary school, as well as all the other things that pupils nowadays struggle with, including social media, never being switched off from your friends and from activity, means that if that's not addressed, sleep problems can become significantly impairing and really affect your academic performance. Those with ADHD also struggle to revise, again putting it off until the last minute, which can affect performance. Those with ADHD may also struggle in exams due to being distracted by things going on around them, but also by missing the questions being asked correctly due to inattention. Some children even miss whole sides of questioning because they didn't turn their papers over and notice that there was more questions there. As children get older, their social interactions become more sophisticated, and particularly in girls, much more related to those social interactions and discussions rather than physical activity. And so for girls, their difficulties may become more apparent as they move into secondary school, with that trouble fitting in and maintaining friendships. Impulsivity in their behaviour may lead to conflict with peers, particularly if that's associated with that emotional dysregulation. So people with ADHD, they can get more extremely upset, more extremely reactive to situations than someone without ADHD, which can be quite intense and difficult for those around them to deal with, and distressing. Those with ADHD may miss social cues because they're not paying attention, and misunderstand social norms because of that. And there is a tendency to be seen as disruptive or distracting in class, so chatting in the corner. The two typical presentations of girls with ADHD is either the sort of super chatty one and assertive and outgoing, speaks without thinking, acts without thinking, or the dreamer who's a bit of a space cadet in the back of the class. Of course, if you're the space cadet dreamer, your difficulties may not be picked up until much later on because they're much less obvious. As I've mentioned, those with ADHD, when they move into secondary school, really need to be better with their time management, turning up on time, getting their homework in on time, getting out of bed rather than procrastinating. Those can all be particularly difficult, as I said, when added in with those hormonal changes, because even if you don't have ADHD as a teenager, you tend to find there's a shift in your sleep-wake cycle, which means you actually are much more optimal getting up an hour or two later than you were when you were in primary school. Problems with planning and organisation, and that extends into your friendships as well. So, forgetting friends' birthdays, forgetting it's Red Nose Day or Dress Down Day, which can be embarrassing, forgetting that you've got to get this particular piece of work in on time or bring the right equipment to school. If you don't have that scaffolding at home and school, then things can fall apart quite quickly. We talked about forgetfulness, difficulty keeping on track of assignments, that poor impulse control with that emotional dysregulation, and challenges with self-motivation and completing long-term projects. So work as a secondary school pupil tends to get longer, with multiple steps involved and different deadlines, and that can be really difficult for someone with ADHD who may have an initial flourish of excitement and motivation that, if it's not helped and managed, can quickly drift off. So thinking about projects that are done over a couple of terms rather than 2 lessons, that might be quite challenging for someone with ADHD, particularly if it's in a subject they're not particularly interested in. And what about higher education and the impact of ADHD there? Well, as I've already mentioned, when you move into higher education, that might mean moving out of the home environment. Then there is a whole nother level of organisation, administration and practical tasks that you have to do regularly to cope. And if you haven't, again, got that scaffolding around you and or routine, then again, as is very common, things can fall apart very quickly. For some of the people I see who are just moving into university, that first term can be a big shock in terms of having to make sure your fridge is full, so you've got food to eat at the right times, that nobody's going to shout at you to get out of bed, do your washing, planning and helping you with your transport, your bills, all of these things, these skills which most people will naturally step up to, those with ADHD will really struggle with if not given help and direction. So problems with time management, managing those multiple deadlines and assignments over a long period of time rather than leaving it to the last minute. Poor time estimation, so managing to get out of bed and get to lectures on time can be tricky. Those with ADHD will have struggles with maintaining a consistent study routine. If a university student has never had to make their own meals, then they may forget to eat because it's not put in front of them, or they might put off making their lunch and never get round to it and suddenly find actually they're super hungry. These are all things that can really impact negatively on a person's ability to study and function in higher education. Problems with focus and concentration, so trouble staying engaged during those, again, longer lectures, being more easily distracted by external stimuli or internal thoughts, because at this point you may well be living in shared accommodation with less space to study. Again, with the inconsistent attention span and difficulty retaining information, those people with ADHD can find that they don't perform as well in their exams, tendency to overlook important details in assignments through skim reading, not reading it properly, or missing the dates for deadlines. They're all things that commonly happen in those with ADHD. When you are at higher education, that independent learning is something that is assumed. So if you haven't got study strategies that are effective and routine for you, you can find that your first set of exams at the end of the first term of university, you can end up failing, and it's only then that everybody steps back and wonders what's going on. But we know that those people with ADHD have big challenges with self-directed learning and self-discipline. They have great difficulty breaking up large tasks into more manageable chunks. They have problems with initiating, sustaining long-term projects because they get bored. They may struggle with studying independently without that external structure that could have been in place in the home and a much more supportive school before university. So in summary, ADHD can significantly impact on your educational experiences and attainment, both in primary and secondary school and in higher education. And if you're not aware of that, then that could have led to underachievement, underattainment, failure, shame, lots of negative things that, if it had been addressed earlier, may not have impacted in such a way, or at least had so many negative consequences. So now is the time to reflect on your experience of education and put together with what we've discussed today. Does that change how you view your experiences? How was school for you? How did your ADHD impact on your experience of school and education? And what strategies did you use or learn in order to manage the difficulties that you had? You might want to have a look now at the Women's Guide to ADHD Mastery and make some notes with a view to really understanding your life and how you got to where you are now. You can find this free to download on my website, www.drvickycleak.co.uk. I hope you enjoyed this webinar, that you found it useful, and I look forward to seeing you at the next one. Goodbye.